Chapter 6. The Vampire's Castle. A vampire and a demon. Would they be friends?
As he pushed the door to the ship's cabin open, the boat jolted. Drac started to pull it from beneath the waves. He glanced back at Zaelith and his vampires who were still out on the deck with Rodney. Rodney was human, and although Alucard was sure these vampires wouldn't attack him, he didn't want to risk leaving him alone. So, as he pushed the cabin door open, he latched it against the wall, keeping it open so he could keep an eye on his guests. He then made his way over to the desk, which sat at the end of the room, moved behind it, and lazily slumped down in the chair, exhaling quietly in relief. Although it hadn't taken very long at all, he felt utterly exhausted, and that had to be because of the portal. He only wanted to take so many vampires, as long as, together, they totaled an age that matched no more than his own, plus half. But he had been made to take Zaelith, who, on his own, was at least 600 years old, and then Ben, who was roughly 300, so that was just over double his age already. The other two vampires were close to 200 years each. He had been made to take a group of over 1,000 years, and that had taken its toll. It had drained a whole lot more of his ethos than what he had been planning, and he wasn't sure how long this exhaustion was going to curse him for. He sighed and pulled off his cape, placing it over the desk before resting his legs upon it, staring up at the ceiling. What were his plans? He'd take these vampires back to his castle, the place he had no choice in setting aside for them to reside within. And then he'd head home. Zaelith obviously wasn't going to stay here until next month, but Alucard had no plans to escort him back to the portal. He could get Rodney to do that. After this, he just wanted to go home and rest, because he was sure as hell going to need it. Tomorrow, he'd be back to work, scouring the lands for werewolves, as per ruled by the treaty he had long ago agreed upon with the humans. The treaty. He had to wait a whole month more. Would Zaelith's vampires stay within the castle for that long? He'd have to tell them. He'd have to run all the rules by them. The last thing he wanted was a rogue vampire killing some human and shattering everything he had worked so hard to build. He just hoped that the humans of the city would welcome the new laws the treaty would set into place. Dor Sanguis was his land, after all. And as much as he didn't want to, if it came to it, he would drive the humans out. The vampires were his people, and he'd do whatever he could to make sure they didn't have to live in fear or solitude. Even if it meant ridding this land of humans. But if he did that, how would they feed? Irritated, he rolled his eyes and took his feet off his desk. Turning in his seat to glare out of the window behind him, he watched as they moved away from the rainy island in the distance. He couldn't drive the humans out. That would doom himself and his people to starvation. He didn't want the land to return to how it once was. Humans and vampires at war. No, he wanted something peaceful. Something of an agreement between the two peoples. And he knew he could get it. He just had to keep trying. He just had to be patient.
I assume you have a place set aside for the vampires to live,
Zaelith said. Alucard turned around to face him.
Did I say you could come in here?
He asked, disguising his startle with anger.
The door is wide open.
Zaelith smiled. The vampire rolled his eyes and sat up straight.
Yes, I have,
he answered, tapping his clawed fingers on the table as he eyed the vampire standing behind Zaelith.
That is where we are headed.
And is it safe? Secure?
He asked.
Why would it not be?
There wasn't much time to plan on either end, so I'm simply being cautious. We are bringing them here so that they may be safe, and I need to make sure that that will be the case.
Alucard sighed and looked back out of the window.
Don't worry, my castle is the safest place in the country, so long as they listen to and abide by my rules.
He grumbled. glancing at the vampires behind Zaelith.
I'm sure they will.
Zaelith smiled. Not at all in the mood for Zaelith's arrogance, Alucard waved his hand in dismissal.
Whatever. Get out.
He mumbled.
The demon smiled a condescending smile, turned around with a quiet scoff, and led the way out of Alucard's room. He didn't have the strength to argue with this vampire. He was so fatigued, and he just wanted to make sure that this plan was going to be successful. There was already so much on his shoulders. The war, the vampires, Damien, werewolves, not to mention his personal affairs, and the fact that there were people out for his head. Helping these vampires was something he wanted to do before his almost inevitable capture. And if he had to work with this Alucard, Vurin, whatever he was called, then he would. As insufferable as he was the one Damien had chosen to help him, so he had to trust that the Daedalus had made the right choice. Without any kind of further argument, he left the room, leaving Alucard on his own once more.
As Zaelith and his vampires left, Alucard sighed and rested his legs upon the table. What had he been thinking about? He frowned. The demon having shattered his trail of thought, the treaty, the plans he had for the city and his people. There wasn't much more he could do there but wait. The treaty had been signed. The council were going to inform the humans, and this time next month, his vampires could walk the city streets as if they were regular people. That was all he wanted for them. But that wasn't all he had to deal with. Not only was the safety and concerns of his vampires heavy on his mind, so was his job to keep the werewolves at bay. Next to that, he was still being hunted by Lucifer and the Diabolus. He hadn't thought about it much lately, but ever since Damien had mentioned it atop the tower, he couldn't deny the angst he felt. Damien was the only thing standing between him and his monster of a father, and that, among several others, was a reason he couldn't deny the Daedalus' orders. If he defied Damien, he would abandon him and leave him to fend for himself. He couldn't survive Lucifer, he knew that too well, and Damien made a point of reminding him as often as he could. He scowled irritably and crossed his arms, resting his head on the side of his chair. He shouldn't worry about Lucifer. He didn't plan to disobey Damien, so there was no way he'd be at risk. However, he hated the fact that that was one of the reasons he had to listen to Damien. But who was he to resent him? That man had saved his life, and was doing so every day by keeping him hidden from his father. These resentful thoughts shouldn't be coming to him. He closed his eyes and sighed quietly, focusing on the fact that he had felt exhausted. His job still wasn't done, and he wasn't sure when he might next be able to rest. So what better time than now to sleep a little? The vampire relaxed, allowing himself to slowly drift off to sleep. But his time of resting didn't last long. The ship started to creak quietly as the serpent below slowed down, approaching the docks. Alucard opened his left eye, glaring out of the door ahead, and as he noticed his castle atop the cliff in the distance, he sighed a quiet, irritated sigh. It was almost over. All he had to do was show the vampires where they would be staying, tell them the rules he had in place, and then he could go home and sleep off whatever this strange exhaustion was. He sat up straight, lazily stretched his arms above his head, and exhaled in hesitation. He didn't want to talk to the demon any more than he had to. But once again, what choice did he have? He climbed to his feet and made his way out onto the ship's deck, glancing over at Zaelith, who was conversating with Ben and the other two vampires. He didn't care to speak to them, so he made his way to the edge of the ship and stared out at his castle as Rodney helped guide the ship into the docks. But a skeptical look found its way onto his face. He glanced back over at the vampires, catching the demon staring at him once more. Zaelith didn't look away. He just smiled, confusing Alucard a whole lot more. Was there something on his back? Is that what Zaelith seemed to be finding so amusing? Rolling his eyes, he glared back out at his castle. He didn't care.
Zaelith then took his eyes off the vampire and set them upon the 6 moons that had appeared in the sky, the clouds clearing above. 6 moons? 2 purple, 1 silver, 1 red, 1 blue, and 1 gold. He wasn't sure how that was possible, considering as the ocean's tides here seemed to be much like those back in his world, and for a moment it made him think about how remarkable these circumstances were. To think that his world was connected to this one, it was somewhat wondrous. The differences, the similarities. He was sure there were a whole lot more than what he had already seen. If only he had more time to spend here, he felt he might quite enjoy it. But he had a lot on his shoulders, and too much to deal with to spare time to travel a new world. Taking his eyes off the moons, he looked back over at Alucard, but the crimson-haired vampire was no longer standing at the edge of the ship. He turned his head toward the cabin, watching as Alucard made his way back out, now wearing the cape he had previously left inside. As the ship ceased to move, who Zaelith assumed to be the captain leapt down from the quarterdeck and down onto the docks, starting to tie the ship's ropes to it.
Fidrak.
The vampire instructed, looking down at Rodney as he tied the ropes. Zaelith listened and observed as his new associate went about his business, trying to get a good enough read on who this vampire was.
If he'll even eat what I give him.
Rodney called, making his way back up onto the ship. He opened the gate and pushed the bridge down towards the dock.
I told you, he's been fussy lately.
Alucard made his way down the bridge as Zaelith and his vampires followed.
Try once more. If he still won't eat, I'll talk to him.
The captain shrugged and sighed as Alucard started to lead his guests along the cobblestone path that led up to his castle.
I'm telling you now, he's not gonna eat.
Irritated, Alucard waved his hand in dismissal, mumbling to himself quietly. Ben then moved closer to Alucard as he led the way up the cliffside.
Your snake isn't eating?
He asked. With a slightly concerned frown, Alucard glanced back at him.
He is dragon.
He corrected, looking ahead again.
And no, he's simply fussy.
What does he eat?
Ben asked. A smirk then found its way to Alucard's face.
I kill the werewolves here and I feed them to Drak.
He shrugged. As the other 2 vampires laughed quietly, Ben laughed aloud in amusement.
I feel like you and I are gonna get along well,
He suggested.
Will we?
Alucard scowled, leading the way up the small flight of stairs, reaching the top of the cliff. Zaelith watched them, a vacant look on his face. Alucard's response to Ben's question was amusing, but he wasn't going to laugh. He was tired, irritated, and just wanted to make sure this plan was going to work. But it seemed as though they were now where Alucard planned to home the vampires from his world, so hopefully he'd finally get an answer. He followed in silence as Alucard led the way towards the huge black castle in the distance. The black bricked fortress overlooked the ocean, its shadow stretching across the slanted land which led down to a vast forest below. The forest stretched for miles, the glow of a city just visible in the distance as a thick fog began to make its way across the land. A swarm of crows circled the tallest tower of the castle, cawing loudly, catching the demon's attention. He glared up at them, their eyes shimmering as crimson as the vampire's hair. Their bodies were torn, burnt, and rotting. They weren't alive, and by the looks of it, they acted as sentries, watching over the castle from above. The demon looked ahead again, following as Alucard led the way to the castle's door. Alucard looked back over his shoulder at the vampires.
You can come in,
He mumbled, granting them entrance into the castle. They all made their way into the castle's entrance hall. The floor was made of a dark oak wood, a small stage-like platform at the end of the room. The ceiling was black and rib-vaulted. The walls just as black with patterned gold engravings throughout them. Tall, arched, stained glass windows were lined along the left and right walls, lighting the room with an array of different, striking colors. A long rectangular table sat within the center of this room, leaving about 15 feet of space between its back and the back wall. Each chair around it tucked in neatly, almost as if they had never been used. Against the right wall, Two suits of steel armor stood a few feet apart from each other, a dark oak door sitting between them. Another, similar door was within the far right corner of the back wall, and another to the left. The back wall also homed a huge circular stained glass window, adorned with paintings of dragons, wolves, and what could only be vampires. The arched windows around the room displayed similar scenes: dragons, wolves, vampires, angels, even demons. Admiring it for a moment, a slightly curious smile found its way to Zaelith's face. Clearly, Alucard had an eye for art. From what he could see and what he knew, the art in these windows could also quite possibly be historic, representing this world's past. The window to his left had what was very clearly Damien in it, a shimmering blue moon covering most of the area behind him. It looked much like the blue moon that sat in the sky outside. The window beside the one possessed the image of a crimson-haired demon, whom he recognized as Lucifer, a blood-red moon shimmering behind him. The windows opposite them were painted with two women, one very angelic-looking woman, a golden moon behind her, and another demon-looking one, a bright purple moon behind her. Where the angel possessed black as night hair, the demon's hair was ashen as snow. Perhaps these were two of Damien's 5 siblings. Zaelith had only ever seen Lucifer, so he wasn't sure what the others looked like. He only knew that they existed. The window beside them possessed the image of a completely cloaked, hooded man, a silvery moon behind him, and the window opposite that one was painted with the image of a tall, long, red-haired man, a black-purple moon in the sky above him. Whoever they were, Zaelith wasn't sure. He could only assume that these 2 other men were also siblings of Damien. They all possessed moons behind them, the same moons that shone in the sky outside. Interesting. Alucard stopped beside the table and turned to face Zaelith and his vampires.
Right, I have rules in place here. You will listen, and when more of your friends arrive, you will also tell them. Understood?
He asked, looking at Ben and the 2 vampires who stood behind him. Zaelith waited to the right of them. Ben nodded.
Yes.
He agreed. Alucard pointed to the back left door.
That is my officer's castle. No one is to enter that door unless I have said so. That will lead you to the kitchen. However, this is also where the human helpers reside. Don't eat them. It would piss me off immensely.
He warned. With a tired sigh, he pointed to the door between the suits of armor.
That door will take you to the part of the castle I have dedicated to every other vampire that lives here. It is daylight-proof, and there are several safe ways in and out than this door. However, the city close to here is not yet ready for us to just vault around, but I have been working on an agreement with the city council. Next month you will all be free to walk around the city and feed off people so long as you don't kill them, and so long as they consent. I will make sure to get my bard to write you all copies of the agreement. Does that all make sense?
He asked, sternly.
Clearly, no one had anything to question or disagree upon, so they nodded. Alucard then frowned and looked over at the silent demon.
Well,
I'd like to see this half of the castle that you have set aside for them. Please.
He smiled. The vampire sighed. He just wanted to go home. But he'd show Zaelith what he wanted to avoid an argument. That was the last thing he needed right now. So, without a word, he turned around and made his way over to the door, which sat along the right wall. He pulled the door open, leading the way into the dark hallway, as Zaelith and the vampires followed. Every window was boarded up so tightly that the moonlight from outside couldn't shine through. The walls here were also black and patterned with gold engravings. The floor made of the same dark wood, but a long red rug stretched down the corridor to cover most of it. They followed the corridor and reached a small lounge-like area. Alucard then led them down another corridor and up several flights of stairs, showing them the entire east wing of the castle, pointing out every single room, all of which consisted of somewhere for the vampires to sleep. For Alucard, the tour felt like just moments in length, his tiredness helping him to somewhat zone out as he led them around. To his relief, Zaelith seemed content with what he had seen, so the vampire led them back to the entrance hall. He made his way over to the table, leaned back against it, and took a moment to wake. He looked over at Zalith.
That is all I would like to bring this to an end.
Zalith took a moment, glancing around the room, and then looked at Alucard.
I'm satisfied.
He answered. He took his eyes off the vampire and looked over at Ben.
This is where we part ways.
He said, holding his arms out, inviting Ben closer. As he and Ben embraced each other, Zalith swiftly kissed his right cheek. Ben then stepped back as Zalith placed one hand on his shoulder.
Are you okay with everything?
He asked, concern in his voice.
Yeah.
He answered, an assured smile on his face.
It's certainly a little different, but I can get used to it. I'm sure we all can. I really appreciate what you're doing for us.
The demon smirked.
Stay out of trouble.
He said. Ben nodded as Zalith let go of his shoulder. Then, the demon looked over at Alucard, an expectant look on his face. Alucard exhaled quietly, stood up straight, and led the way over to the door, escorting him out of the castle. As they stepped outside, Zalith stopped and faced the vampire.
Thank you, Viren, truly, for helping us. I wouldn't have ever suggested this to Damien if things in Alteria weren't so dire.
Looking over at him, Alucard shrugged.
They'll be safe here.
He muttered, preparing to walk off down towards the forest.
Seeing that he was about to leave him, Zalith smiled slightly.
So, do tell me about this city.
He requested, turning towards the path that led down to the docks. He wasn't quite ready to part ways with this vampire yet, and he hoped his request would get him to accompany him on his way back to the island. The vampire followed behind him.
What about it?
He grumbled.
A treaty with humans.
Alucard sighed as they made their way down the cliffside.
This land was empty. The only people that lived here were the people that raised me. I left when I was 5 and came back when I was 21 to find that humans had built their villages throughout the land. I wasn't too bothered back then, but once I was done with some business, I wanted my land back, but I'm a vampire, so I need humans around. The next best option was to see if I could cohabit, hence the forming of this treaty.
He explained, reaching the bottom of the cliff. Zalith nodded.
It took a lot of convincing. They didn't care that I was born here, that the land was named after me, that the land is mine. So I asked them what I can do for them to prove that I can be an ally rather than an enemy. They have me killing werewolves. They hunt the humans for sport, kill their livestock or whatever. They said kill the wolves and we'll form a treaty. So I kill the wolves and feed them to my dragon to keep them from turning into hellhounds.
He continued as he led the way up onto the ship once more. Rodney looked over at him.
I guess you need me to take you back.
He called. Alucard looked up at him as he stood atop the quarterdeck.
Duh.
He confirmed. Then, as Rodney prepared to disembark, Alucard led the way into the cabin.
I have been doing so for 6 months. I spoke to the council yesterday, and they have told me the treaty should be coming in effect this time next month. They made me wait long enough. The werewolves aren't killing a single human since I got back. Either the humans are dumb, or they won't accept the fact that I live up to my end of the deal.
The demon laughed quietly in amusement as Alucard sat down, inviting him to sit in the chair in front of his desk. As Zalith sat down and the ship started moving, Alucard exhaled deeply and shrugged.
I think they know that. If they don't agree with it and come through with their part, I will turn hostile. And I will. This is my land. If I have to rid them from it like vermin, then I will.
Humans are a repulsive species. There's no doubt in my mind that they may try to work their way out of this deal you made. It often happens to be the case with them. I advise you to keep an eye on them. Be persistent. Remind them of their place.
Glancing over at him, Alucard nodded a single nod.
I know.
Amused by his response, Zaelith laughed quietly.
The vampire then scowled. Why did this demon find everything so amusing? If he wasn't staring and smiling, he was laughing at something that wasn't at all meant to be funny. He didn't care. He rolled his eyes and glared out of the window, unable to see anything through the thickening fog. But the sound of rain wasn't too far away, so it wouldn't be too long until they reached the island, until he could finally go home and rest. He glanced over at the demon. To no surprise, Zaelith was staring once more, and it made Alucard feel so very uncomfortable. He frowned and glared out of the window again, trying to ignore Zaelith's expectant stare. So, he thought, his plans, what were they tomorrow? Werewolf hunting, as usual. He could speak to Zaelith's vampires some more and make sure they were comfortable. That they knew where everything else was within the castle. He also had to be adamant about them not feeding on humans until the treaty was in place. They would simply have to do what the rest of his resident vampires did. Wait for him to bring them blood. He ought to get someone else to do that. But then, what would he have to do other than hunt werewolves? Not much. With an irritated sigh, he looked over at the staring demon.
What are we doing next month? I will meet with you once more. Are you coming back here or are you staying there?
I will stay behind the next time we meet.
Zaelith answered. Alucard nodded and looked down at the table. He didn't really have anything else to say. The demon was still staring, the silence was still awkward, and he was still tired. There was no point in asking him to leave now so that he may rest. The island was less than 15 minutes away.
They sat there in utter silence. Alucard glared out the window, and Zaelith continued to eye the vampire. To Zaelith's relief, this plan seemed as though it might just work. Ben and 2 others had already been safely transported, but he wasn't going to relax until more of the vampires had safely been taken from Altaria and moved here to Alvengard. Although at first, he had thought this vampire incompetent and an idiot, this first night had already swayed him from that assumption. Although Alucard was arrogant, Zaelith found himself almost liking him in some strange way. Perhaps a friendship may form one day. There were a few things he had come to realize about this man that he could relate with, and he found himself enjoying the conversation he had just had. It wasn't much of a discussion on his end. Still, he had enjoyed listening to him, and he certainly enjoyed looking at him. He then finally took his eyes off the vampire and looked down at his desk. He felt he may miss Ben a little, but his pursuit of that man was over. It had been something of an amusing distraction for a while, to pursue a man that wasn't interested in him in such a way. However, Ben now lived in an entirely different world, and he had also begun to grow bored of that vampire. Whatever he had been seeking there, it was over.
The ship soon stopped. The sound of it doing so relieved Alucard. The vampire stood up, as did Zaelith, and led the way out onto the deck. Rodney had already lowered the bridge, waiting beside it as Alucard and Zaelith walked down onto the island. The pair made their way over to the portal, but before stepping through, Zaelith turned to face Alucard once more.
I shall see you next month, then,
he said.
Duh.
Alucard mumbled tiredly. Then, Zaelith turned around and walked through the portal without another word, leaving Alucard alone. As soon as he left, Alucard snarled and exhaled in both irritancy and relief. Now, finally, he could go home and sleep.
Hey, Dragster no-
I'll be their face, Kuasta Singer.
Alucard growled, before disappearing into vermilion mist, speeding away into the fog without giving Rodney a chance to argue with his fucking deal with it yourself. The captain crossed his arms and pouted.
I hate him sometimes.
He grumbled.